Hello, Dr. Nador. This is Carlos Serrano.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Dr. Michael?
Yes.
Yeah,
Sorry about that. I didn't have my headset on right at first.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm Carlos Serrano, the journalist that I contacted you yesterday.
Yes, I've been looking forward to talking with you. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you. And you?
Doing very well.
Okay, so as I told you, I'm working on this piece about the study. So I have a few questions to you. So first, could you give me like a general thoughts about this study?
So this is an interesting study. So Tanstanin, the one that they're referring to, was one of the very few studies that showed an association between death by suicide and nightmares.
Mm-hmm.
Not that other studies had, failed to find it. It's just one of the few that actually looked at death as an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a neat follow-up to that study, and it's a larger sample from the same country that also looks separately at military veterans to see whether or not, it's just trauma exposure that's causing the relationship between nightmares and suicide. And what it found is that it's not just trauma exposure, that in the general population, you still see this association between nightmares and suicide. And you see it for those in the military, too. So it suggests that it's the presence of nightmares that's likely playing a large role in this relationship. And when you look at the statistics, having frequent nightmares on average is putting people at about 80% higher risk of suicide, which is really notable when you think about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
that's my initial take on it.
Okay. So, Professor, how does this study add to what scientists already know?
I think in a couple ways. First, it's one of the only studies that's actually looked at death by suicide, which is very meaningful because the other predictors of suicide are quite a distance from it. For instance, thoughts of suicide are one of the things that we study, but thankfully the vast majority of people that have thoughts of suicide never actually go on and die by suicide. So they're not the greatest predictor. Same with even suicide attempts. We know that, there are 25 suicide attempts for every one person that dies by suicide. So it's still quite a ways from actual death by suicide. So to best understand death by suicide, we need studies that actually look at death by suicide. So it's one of the very few that has done that with nightmares. And it certainly adds to the literature by showing or suggesting that it's not just exposure to trauma or war or those things that are causing the nightmares, but the nightmares are independently associated with death by suicide. And so it adds to a literature that's been arguing stronger and stronger that we need to look at nightmares as an independent risk factor for suicide and also consider treating nightmares. We're still very early on in studies looking at treating nightmares to reduce suicide, but the early findings are very, very positive. So I think it just lends further evidence that that's where we need to be going as a field, focusing on this is a significant risk factor. It's not just a symptom of PTSD. It's not just, significant only if someone has a trauma history. Having nightmares are a risk factor for suicide and something that we need to think about as clinicians and consider treating.
So, Professor, do you have any reservations about this study?
Not really. Every study has its limitations. This is a very strong study. The limitation is going to be that we don't know if they're having nightmares right before their suicide, for instance. So they were often assessed very long before they actually died or anything happened to them. So with that, that's one limitation. But still, it's such an addition to the literature because so few studies have looked at death by suicide. The limitations that are there, it really overrules. Another thing that could be said is this was done in Finland. Does this generalize to the United States? Well, the thing is, the European countries have laws that actually allow researchers to do this type of research, where they can go into the death databases and see how people died. We don't have that here in the U.S. So we actually couldn't do a study like this here in the U.S. based upon the way the laws are right now. So even though there's the question of does it generalize, on the other hand, we can't even do this here. So it's a very strong study.
Professor, can you please explain me a little bit more about the legislation here in the States?
The regulation with, you mean with the laws and trying to do cause of death? Well, what it really is so as you probably saw in the study, a lot of these European countries, Sweden has this, Finland has this, have this database. It's kind of like a death database for researchers, for people, where you can match up like someone who is in your study and see what actually happened to them, see if they died, see how they died. We don't have anything like that, partially because of privacy laws, partially just because as a country we haven't put our resources in developing a resource like this. So there's not a specific law I point to other than I hear, it's privacy laws a lot of times to get in the way. But I don't know anything specifically beyond that, but I know that there have been people interested in trying to do it in the past and haven't been able to do so.
Okay. Professor, what are the next steps in the nightmares and suicide area?
Great question. I think the next step is continuing to look at treating nightmares in addition to the treatment we're doing normally for suicide. So I'm not saying that we should only treat nightmares for suicidal people, but I'm saying in addition to the treatment that they already did, the best practices, let's look at adding nightmare treatment onto that and see if we get significantly better outcomes. The data are still young, but it looks very promising that adding nightmare treatment onto the treatment we're already doing is going to lead to better outcomes for people with nightmares who are suicidal. So I think the next step is first doing those treatment studies, and then second, we still don't have a good understanding of why nightmares are associated with suicide. And that's where a lot of my research has been, is trying to understand that relationship. So we need to keep working on understanding that relationship, because the better we understand it, the more we can design interventions to minimize the effects of nightmares and to reduce suicidal ideation and behaviors among these individuals.
Okay, Professor, is there something else do you want to add?
I don't think so. It's a good story, and I'm really thrilled that you're writing about it. I think it's going to be, in the coming years, a very important topic. So I appreciate you covering it.
No, I really appreciate your time, and thank you very much for your collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me know if there's anything else I can do to help you.
Okay, thank you. Have a safe trip.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Sample that has been collected in Finland, and we actually found out that in that sample that spans 40 years, there are quite a few veterans of the Second World War still in the sample. And even after 30 years the war has ended, those veterans still had more nightmares than other people. And then there was this older study about nightmares and suicide, and it was also using the same data, but they were not aware that there were war veterans in the data. So they did this study and found out that nightmares predict suicide, but there were actually a lot of war veterans involved. And we thought that maybe it is not the nightmares, but it is the war experience. And then we decided that we want to do this study again and improve upon it by looking at these war veterans. Because it's a good practice in science, always try to replicate and improve older studies and not just trust the first results.
Okay. Professor, what is the most significant about this study's findings?
I would say that the most significant finding is that even if you control for these war experiences, nightmares still increase the risk for suicide. So they were not increasing the risk a huge deal, so suicides are very rare, so those people who do not have nightmares do very little suicides, and those who have nightmares also do very little suicides, but little bit more than those that do not have nightmares. And there was no major effect of these war experiences to this suicide risk. So it seems that something else that is related to nightmares might also increase suicide risk, and it is not just about these post-traumatic nightmares, about war experiences or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And how this study contribute to the field?
It is improving upon prior work. So there was this result going on in the study of nightmares that they will probably increase the risk for suicide. But our study made improvements upon the older study that actually found this out. And now we know, in science we do not know anything for sure, but we are more confident that nightmares really increase suicide risk.
Mm-hmm. And doctor, did you find? I mean, what will be any limitations or like limitation that you will mention this study have?
Yeah, there were a lot of limitations. We have in Finland this data series that has been collected for 40 years, and that is very unique, and we should try to use them as much as possible. But of course, we used questionnaires that were completed in 70s and 80s, and we cannot anymore do any changes to them. And the questionnaires were not optimal, so the questions about nightmares were not perfect. And also this study is correlational, so we do not really know what causes the suicide from the nightmares. So this study could be improved upon by measuring nightmares better and following these people more closely. But we have to use the data that we have.
Mm-hmm. Is there any surprise finding or something that you're considering that unexpected finding?
Yes, I personally was pretty sure that when we are looking at these war veterans, the war experiences are very important for the suicide risk, and nightmares are not so important. Mm-hmm. But it seems that that is not the case. So nightmares are important for suicide risk, even if the war experiences are controlled for. And in these data that we have available, the war experiences didn't have much effect for the suicide risk.
Mm-hmm. What about the ordinary people? I mean, if they read this study, people may think that if they are having nightmares, they are going to commit suicide. I mean, so what can we say to common people that maybe feel, afraid of reading a study like this?
Yes, this is a statistical finding. So there is a risk for committing suicide, and that risk is very small. And with nightmares, it becomes a little bit bigger, but it is still very small. So most people who have nightmares will not commit suicide or have any self-harm behaviors. But other take-home message that we have here is that many people don't think that dreams or nightmares are very important for their well-being, but there are these studies that nightmares actually are related to depression and sleep problems, and even a little bit to these suicides. So that would mean that if you have a lot of nightmares, it might be a good idea to talk to some professional about it, because it might be an indication that there are a lot of stress or some problems in your life, and there should be looked upon. But it does not mean that everyone is committing suicide if they have nightmares.
So do you think that like a very clear message is to say that having nightmares is not exactly a cause-effect relationship with committing suicide?
Yes, you could say that, from these studies we cannot yet know that. But we know that nightmares are one indication of stress, or there are symptoms of some kind of ill-being that might lead to some serious concerns, but usually, of course, it doesn't.
Doctor, what will be the next steps? I mean, continuing about investigating about this issue, what is the will be the next steps?
Well, there isn't really a good data available to improve upon this study that we did. So personally, I think my research will go towards more of these other sleep disorders. So I'm thinking about studying that how this modern environment with all the technology and internet, smartphones, that kind of things actually affect sleep quality and dreaming. But I think this nightmare project, and especially this project about suicide, I am not going to continue it, but someone can, of course, take it up and try to improve on these studies.
Professor, is there anything else you want to add about this study that you think people may find interesting?
Well, I don't have an idea right now. Well, I think what I would like to say to, for example, medical health professionals is that it might be a good idea in the future that people are asked about their nightmares if they come to a doctor or psychologist, because they are often overlooked, and there might be this indication that there is something wrong. So they should have a more prominent role in the well-being, studying of well-being of people.
Doctor, I saw that this study was published online on March, but when it was published in a print version.
I think the one that was published was the final version, so there were not several versions. Or did I understand correctly?
No, sorry, I saw in the website that the study was published on March.
Yes.
Yeah. When was it published in a printed version?
Oh, yes, the actual scientific article is published in this scientific reports online journal, so I don't think it is print version available.
Ah, okay.
But it is open access, so everyone can access it on the journal website.
Okay, perfect. Well, Professor, they were my questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good day. Bye-bye.